The porch light was off. That was the first thing Alex Devereux noticed as the car eased down the narrow street he'd grown up on, tires crackling over gravel his mother used to sweep every Sunday morning like it was church itself. The light had never been off. Not once. Not in 26 years. Odessa Devereux kept that bulb burning the way other people kept a promise, steady, without fail. A small fire that said, "Someone is coming home eventually, and I'll be ready." He stepped out of the car before the driver had fully stopped, the September air thick and warm against a face that hadn't felt Georgia humidity in 3 years. The house looked smaller than he remembered, paint peeling at the shutters, the mailbox leaning sideways like it had given up standing straight. The grass, once trimmed in careful diagonal lines because his mother believed a yard said something about the people who lived behind it, had gone shaggy and yellow in patches. He stood there a moment too long, keys forgotten in his pocket, an old duffel bag of gifts hanging useless from his shoulder, a silk scarf for his mother, a watch for each of his brothers, small tokens of a homecoming he'd rehearsed in his head on the long flight over. He'd imagined this moment so many times it almost felt like memory already. His mother's scream of joy from the porch, the way she'd cover her mouth with both hands before running down the steps in her house slippers, not caring who saw. He'd imagined Terence clapping him on the back, Julian hugging him too long the way he always did. He had not imagined this, the stillness, the wrongness settling into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the quiet. Then the door opened, slow, and a boy, no, a man now, 28 years old, with tired eyes, froze in the doorway when he saw his baby brother standing there. "Alex," Julian said, and his voice cracked in the middle of the word like something breaking. Behind him, the house was dark. To understand how a homecoming turns into a reckoning, we have to go back to where it all started, in a house that used to be full of noise. Odessa Devereux raised 3 boys alone in a 2-bedroom house on Larkspur Lane on a nursing assistant's salary that never quite stretched far enough, but somehow always did. She worked nights at Mercy General, comes home late, and still found the strength to sit at the kitchen table helping with homework until her eyes gave out. She was the kind of mother who gave everything and asked for nothing, who wore the same coat for 11 winters so her sons could have new shoes for school, who prayed over 3 empty chairs every night her boys were out working odd jobs to help keep the lights on. Terence was the oldest, sharp-tongued and charming, the one people called a natural leader, though what that leadership usually meant was that things got done his way and other people did the doing. Teachers loved him in the way teachers love confident children, and that confidence had, over the years, curdled into something closer to entitlement, a quiet belief that he was owed more than his circumstances had given him. Julian came second, quieter, easily swayed, the peacekeeper who avoided conflict by simply agreeing with whoever spoke last, whose report cards always said, "works well with others," because disappearing into the group had always felt safer than standing apart from it. And then there was Alex, the youngest, the one who watched more than he talked, who noticed the way his mother's hands trembled after double shifts, who counted the number of times she skipped her own dinner so there'd be enough left for the boys, and made a promise to himself, silent and fierce, that one day he would make sure she never had to work herself to exhaustion again. Odessa never complained. That was, in its own way, the thing that made her sons who they became. Terence learned that sacrifice was simply what mothers did, invisible and endless, and never thought to question what it cost her. Alex learned the opposite lesson from the same silence, that the people who give the most are often the ones who ask the least, and that someone has to notice, has to keep count, has to eventually pay it back. He was 17 when he first said it out loud. "Mama, one day I'm going to buy you a house with a porch big enough for all your plants." Odessa laughed, tired and warm, and pulled him into a hug that smelled like her lavender lotion. Baby, all I need is you boys taking care of each other. That's the only house I need." He never forgot those words. He just didn't yet understand how heavy a promise like that could get to carry. At 19, Alex left for a logistics apprenticeship overseas, a scholarship-backed program in the UAE that promised real training, real pay, a real future. It nearly broke Odessa's heart to see him go, but she was the one who packed his bag, tucking a small Bible into the side pocket and pressing folded bills into his palm that she could not afford to give. "Go on now," she told him at the airport, holding his face in both hands. "Go build something."
"I'll be right here." He believed her. He had no reason not to. What Alex didn't know, what he wouldn't learn for years, was that the moment his plane left the ground, something in his family's foundation had already begun to shift. Terrence had always resented playing second to nobody, and with Alex gone and their father having walked out a decade earlier, the house on Larkspur Lane became Terrence's territory. He was 23 then, working sporadically, spending more, and increasingly annoyed at the idea that his mother's modest home, paid off after 20 years of sacrifice, was an asset just sitting there. Julian, for his part, simply followed. He always had. Alex's rise didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't handed to him. It was built brick by brick, mistake by mistake, in warehouses and shipping yards and boardrooms where he was often the only black man in the room and had to work twice as hard to be heard once. He learned freight logistics inside out, then international trade regulations, then how capital moved across borders faster than product ever could. By 22, he'd started a small freight brokerage with 2 employees and a laptop in a rented studio apartment. By 25, that brokerage had become a full logistics firm with contracts spanning 3 continents. By 27, Alex Devereux was worth more money than anyone from Larkspur Lane had ever dreamed of, and he had done it without forgetting where he came from or who he'd promised. Every single week, without fail, Alex called home. "How's Mama doing?" he'd ask Terrence, phone pressed to his ear during rare quiet moments between meetings, voice softening the way it only did for family. "She still taking her blood pressure medicine? She still going to church on Sundays?" "She's good, man, she's good. You know Mama, she's tough. Don't worry about her. Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm sending more this month. The account should show it by Friday." Yeah, I'll tell her. She's proud of you, man. Real proud." And Alex believed every word, because why wouldn't he? Terrence was his brother, blood, the one person he trusted to be his eyes and ears in a home he couldn't physically be in. There was a particular call, 7 months in, that Alex would replay in his mind later with a different kind of clarity. He'd been standing on a balcony overlooking the Dubai skyline at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, and had called just to hear a familiar voice. "You sound tired," Terrence had said, and Alex remembered laughing, telling him it was worth it, that every long night was a brick in the house he was building for Mama. "She'd be real proud to hear you say that," Terrence told him. "She was just asking about you yesterday, telling Miss Loretta how her baby's out there conquering the world." Alex had hung up that night smiling, picturing his mother telling the neighbors about him, warmed by an image that, he would later learn, had never actually happened. Odessa hadn't spoken to Loretta in weeks at that point, not because she didn't want to, but because shame had already begun keeping her indoors. Every month, like clockwork, Alex wired money. For groceries, for the electric bill, for Odessa's medications, for a new roof when Terrence mentioned a storm had damaged the old one. $15,000 over 2 years, sent in careful increments, each transfer accompanied by the same question. "Is Mama okay?" And every time, the answer came back smooth and reassuring, wrapped around a lie so practiced, it no longer even felt like one to the man telling it. The truth was uglier. The truth was that Terrence had absorbed most of that money into his own expenses, a car, then another car after he wrecked the first, a lifestyle that required upkeep he couldn't otherwise afford.
The truth was that the new roof was never installed. The truth was that Julian saw pieces of what was happening and said nothing. Because saying something meant conflict, and conflict was the one thing Julian had spent his whole life avoiding. The truth was that Odessa, proud and unwilling to be a burden, stopped mentioning the things she needed once she realized her sons weren't going to provide them. It happened slowly, the way most quiet tragedies do. Not one dramatic moment of abandonment, but 100 small withdrawals that added up to the same thing. First, it was skipping the hair appointment she used to treat herself to every other Friday. Then it was the blood pressure medication she began rationing, cutting pills in half to stretch a 30-day supply into 2 months, telling herself it was probably fine, that the doctor probably padded the dosage anyway. Then the space heater in the corner of the living room, purchased with her own savings because the furnace had gone unfixed through one entire winter, and she didn't want to keep asking Terrence about it and hearing the irritation creep into his voice. Then the isolation, slow, creeping, almost invisible even to her, after Terrence stopped bringing her along to family gatherings on his girlfriend's side. Didn't want to answer questions about how she was doing. She stopped answering Loretta's knocks some days, not out of anger, but out of a tired kind of shame that told her it was easier to disappear a little than to explain what her sons had let happen to her. By the time anyone outside that house noticed, disappearing had become a habit. By the time Alex had built an empire, his mother was alone in a house with a broken furnace and a son who lied to him every single week to keep the money and the guilt from ever catching up to him. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday. Alex was in a glass-walled office 30 floors above a foreign city, closing what would become the largest contract of his young career, when his assistant knocked and told him a woman named Loretta Simmons had been trying to reach him for 2 days. He almost didn't take the call. He almost let it go to voicemail, like a dozen other unfamiliar numbers that week. But some old instinct that had nothing to do with logic, made him pick up. "Alex, baby. It's Miss Loretta from next door. I'm sorry to bother you. I got your number from your mama's old address book. I hope that's all right." His stomach dropped before she said another word. "Is she okay?" The same question he'd asked 100 times before, but this time the pause on the other end of the line lasted just a fraction too long. "I think you need to come home, baby," Loretta said, her voice careful, measured, the voice of someone choosing each word like it might shatter something. "I think you need to see for yourself." He didn't sleep that night. He booked the earliest flight out, canceled 3 meetings that had taken months to secure, and sat in first class, staring at nothing for 14 hours, running through every possibility his mind could conjure and rejecting each one, because none of them made sense. Terrence had told him she was fine. Terrence told him every week she was fine. He had planned for months to surprise his mother, to fly home unannounced with a car full of gifts, to finally hand her the keys to the house he'd promised her at 17, porch and all. He had imagined her face 1,000 times. Shock, then joy, then that particular laugh she had that sounded like it came from somewhere deep and unbreakable. He never imagined arriving to a porch light that had been dark for months. Julian let him into the house that evening, hands shaking, unable to meet his brother's eyes. She's resting," he said, which Alex would later understand was the gentlest possible way of avoiding the truth. The living room was dim, curtains drawn against daylight that hadn't been let in for what looked like weeks. The furniture Alex remembered, the floral couch his mother had saved 2 years to buy, was gone, replaced by something thinner and cheaper. Photos that used to line the mantel, family photos, images of 3 boys growing up in this very house, had been taken down. In their place, nothing, just faint outlines on the wallpaper where frames used to hang, like ghosts of a family that used to exist here. "Where is she?" Alex asked, and his voice didn't sound like his own. "He found her in the back room, Not the master bedroom she'd slept in for 20 years, but the small guest room, the one with the window that didn't close all the way. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair, once always neatly pressed, was pulled back loose and gray in a way that made her look 10 years older than her 61 years. She was sitting in a chair by the window, a blanket over her knees despite the warm evening, and when she turned and saw her youngest son standing in the doorway, her whole face broke open. "Alex," she whispered, and it took everything in him not to fall apart right there. "My baby, you came home." He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his, hands that trembled now in a way he'd never felt before, hands that felt too light, too fragile. "Mama, what happened? What happened to you?" And even then, even in that moment, weak and neglected and alone in a room that used to be a guest room in her own house, Odessa Devereux tried to protect her sons. "Nothing happened, baby. I'm just getting older, that's all. You know how it is." "Mama," his voice cracked. "The porch light's been off. The furniture's gone. You're in the back room. Somebody tell me what happened." She looked away from him, toward the window, toward the dark where the porch light should have been shining. "Don't you worry about your brothers," she said quietly. "They've got their own struggles." It was the closest she would come that first night to telling him the truth.
But it was enough, because in that single sentence, "Don't you worry about your brothers," Alex understood that his mother had been suffering in silence for longer than he could bear to imagine, and had been protecting the very people who caused it, right up until the moment her youngest son walked back through that door. He didn't sleep that night either. He sat in the kitchen long after his mother had drifted into an exhausted rest, staring at bank statements he'd pulled up on his phone, cross-referencing every transfer he'd sent over 2 years against a mental timeline of every conversation he'd had with Terrence. $15,000. Where had it gone? Quick task. If you're enjoying this story and you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you. Now back to the story. Miss Loretta came by the next morning with a casserole dish and a look on her face that told him she'd been waiting years for someone to finally ask her the right questions. She was 73 years old, had lived next door to the Devereux family since before Alex was born, and had a way of looking at a person that made it clear she'd already decided how much of the truth she was going to tell before she ever opened her mouth. "I tried to call you myself more than once," she told him, sitting across the kitchen table, her voice low so it wouldn't carry to the back room. "Ma got your number off an old birthday card your mama kept in her drawer. But your brother, Terrence, he always had some excuse when I mentioned it to him. Said your mama didn't want to worry you overseas, said everything was handled." She shook her head slowly, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. "Baby, nothing was handled. That furnace has been broken since February. I know because I'm the one who heard her coughing through the wall some nights and came over with extra blankets. She's been rationing her heart medication because she said she didn't want to bother anybody about getting more, like asking for what keeps you alive was some kind of imposition. I started bringing her groceries myself when I realized the fridge was near empty most weeks. Told her it was too much for one person so she wouldn't feel like charity. But we both knew what it was." She paused, studying him carefully, the way someone studies a person to see how much weight they can carry before they break. "I loved your mother's spirit before all this. She used to be the loudest one at the block parties, you remember? Always the first one dancing. I watched that get smaller and smaller month by month, and I didn't know how to stop it without her son's permission to interfere." Alex sat very still, hands flat on the table, trying to keep his breathing even. "I sent money every month for all of that." Loretta's eyes softened with something like pity, not for him, but for what he was about to understand. Then somebody's been keeping that money from ever reaching her. The pieces he'd been avoiding assembled themselves into a shape he couldn't look away from. He found Terrence's number and called before he could think better of it.
It rang 4 times before his brother picked up, voice carrying that same easy, practiced warmth. "Yo, what's up, man? You good?" "I'm home, Terrence." A pause. Just slightly too long. "Home? Home? You're in Georgia right now?" "I'm sitting in Mama's kitchen, looking at a fridge Miss Loretta had to fill because it was empty, looking at a furnace that's been broken since February, looking at a mother who's been sleeping in the guest room because I don't even know why yet." His voice was rising now, something hot and furious, cracking through the calm he'd held on to for years. "You told me she was fine. Every week for 2 years I asked you, and you told me she was fine." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Alex almost hung up just to fill it. "I didn't want you to worry," Terrence finally said, and even then, even caught, his voice carried more irritation than remorse. "You were out there building your empire. What were you going to do, fly home every time something broke?" "I sent $15,000, Terrence. Where did it go?" Another pause. This one had the sound of a door closing. "I had some expenses," Terrence said. "Look, it's not that deep, man. She's fine. She's always been fine. You're overreacting." Alex looked up and saw his mother standing in the kitchen doorway, having heard every word, her face unreadable in the dim morning light. "I'll call you back," Alex said, and ended the call before his brother could offer another excuse. The days that followed peeled back layer after layer of a truth Alex hadn't been prepared for. It wasn't just neglect, though the neglect alone would have been enough to break him. It was calculated in a way that took real effort to sustain over 2 years, and understanding that effort was somehow worse than any single act of cruelty could have been. Terrence had convinced their mother in the early days after Alex left to sign over power of attorney just in case anything happens, Mama, just so I can help you manage things while Alex is overseas. She'd trusted him. Of course she had. He was her son. And she had spent her whole life believing that trust between family was the one thing that didn't need to be earned twice. With that authority, Terrence had slowly redirected portions of the money Alex sent, framed as managing the household finances, a phrase vague enough to explain almost anything if anyone had ever thought to ask. He'd taken out a small loan against the house itself, using it as collateral without fully explaining the risk to Odessa, who signed where he told her to sign because she didn't want to seem like she doubted him. He used those funds for a car he later wrecked, then a replacement car that cost more than the first, each purchase justified in his own mind as something he deserved for carrying a burden nobody else was there to share. The furnace repair Alex had wired money for specifically, $3,000, sent the previous November with an explicit note attached, "For the furnace, make sure it gets done before winter," never happened. The money went instead toward a security deposit on an apartment Terrence had been quietly planning to move into, a plan that would have left Odessa alone in the house entirely had circumstances not intervened first. Julian, when Alex finally cornered him alone in the backyard, broke down within minutes, guilt spilling out of him in a way that felt less like honesty and more like relief at finally being allowed to stop pretending. He'd known about the loan. He'd seen the furnace repair invoice that was never paid, sitting unopened on the kitchen counter for months, gathering dust until it eventually disappeared. Thrown away, Julian suspected, so Odessa would stop being reminded of it every time she walked past. "I knew," Julian admitted, unable to look at his brother, tears running freely down a face that still looked in flashes like the boy Alex grew up with. "I knew he wasn't telling you the truth. I saw the bills piling up. I saw Mama in that back room and I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know how to say something without it turning into a whole thing with Terrence, and I just..." His voice broke entirely. "I let it happen. I'm so sorry, Alex. I let it happen." There was a version of Alex, an angrier version, that might have walked away from both his brothers entirely in that moment, and for a few days he came close. He sat with his mother in the evenings, held her hand while she slowly began to talk, really talk, for the first time since he'd arrived, about the loneliness of the past 2 years, about Terrence's growing coldness once his requests for money stopped being subtle, about the humiliation of asking a neighbor for groceries because she didn't want her own sons to know she was struggling. "Why didn't you tell me?" Alex asked her one evening, the two of them sitting on the back steps under a porch light he'd already had an electrician come replace that morning. Odessa was quiet for a long moment before she answered. "Because you sounded so happy on those calls, baby. You were building something. I didn't want to be the reason you had to stop and worry about home. I thought if I just held on a little longer, you'd come back and everything would sort itself out." She looked at him, eyes glassy but steady. "I didn't think it would take this long, and I didn't know your brother was lying to you the whole time. I want you to believe that. I didn't know." He did believe her. That was the hardest part. Understanding that his mother's silence hadn't been about not trusting him, but about loving him so completely that she chose to suffer quietly rather than interrupt the life he was building. The confrontation with Terrence happened 4 days later, in the living room of the house he'd been slowly stripping bare for 2 years. Alex had spent those 4 days gathering everything: bank statements, the power of attorney documents, a timeline of every phone call and every lie stacked neatly against every wire transfer. He didn't come to yell. He came with proof. Terrence arrived expecting an argument he could talk his way out of, the way he'd talked his way out of every uncomfortable conversation for the last decade. What he found instead was his youngest brother sitting calmly at the kitchen table with a folder in front of him, and their mother sitting beside him, present for once instead of protected. "Sit down," Alex said, and something in his voice, quiet, controlled, absolutely certain, made Terrence do exactly that. Alex laid it out, piece by piece, the transfers, the dates, the loan against the house, the furnace that was never fixed. He didn't raise his voice once, and somehow that made it worse for Terrence than shouting ever could have. There was no anger to push back against, only fact after fact after fact, undeniable and precisely documented. "I trusted you," Alex said, finally, closing the folder. "Every week, I called and asked if she was okay, and every week you looked me in the eye, or as close as a phone call gets, and you lied. Not once, not twice. For 2 years, Terrence. You let me believe I was taking care of her, while you let her sit in a cold house alone." Terrence's composure finally cracked, but what came out wasn't remorse. It was defensiveness, old resentments spilling out sideways. "You left, man. You got to go build your big life overseas while I was the one still here, still dealing with everything. You think it's easy being the one everybody expects to handle things? You don't know what that's like." "So you punished Mama for it," Alex said flatly. "That's what you're telling me. You resented me, so you took it out on the one person who never did anything but sacrifice for both of us." "I didn't punish her." Terrence's voice rose for the first time, sharp with the particular defensiveness of a man who has told himself a story so many times he's started to believe it. "I was handling things. You weren't here, Alex. You don't know what it's like being the one everybody calls when the pipes freeze, when the car won't start, when Mama's crying because she misses her baby boy who's off living his best life overseas." "Then you should have called me and told me that," Alex said. And for the first time his voice cracked just slightly, the calm control slipping to reveal the exhaustion underneath. "You could have told me you were struggling. You could have told me the truth, any part of it, at any point in 2 years. Instead, you looked me in the eye every week and told me she was fine, while she sat in a cold room rationing pills. That's not handling things, Terrence. That's lying to your own brother while your own mother suffered for it." The room went silent. Odessa reached over and placed her hand over her youngest son's, a small gesture, grounding him before the moment could tip into something neither of them could take back. Across the table, Terrence's jaw worked like he wanted to say something else, some final defense, but nothing came. For the first time since Alex had walked back into this house, his oldest brother looked less like a man cornered and more like a man finally seeing clearly the shape of what he'd done. "I want the power of attorney reversed, today, and you're going to sit with Mama and tell her the truth about where that money went, all of it, because she deserves to hear it directly from you, not piece it together from what I've found." Terrence didn't argue. Whatever fight had been in him drained out somewhere in the last 20 minutes, replaced with the exhausted look of a man finally facing something he'd spent 2 years avoiding. What happened over the following weeks wasn't a fairy tale fix. Alex didn't wave a check in the air and pretend money could repair what trust had broken.
But he did what he'd promised at 17 years old, standing in a kitchen that smelled like his mother's cooking, only bigger now, more real. He bought the house outright, paid off the loan Terrence had taken against it, and began renovations. Not extravagant ones, but careful, thoughtful changes. A new furnace, new furniture, including a floral couch not unlike the one that had disappeared, and a porch, extended and rebuilt, wide enough for the garden of plants his mother had always wanted. Julian, humbled and genuinely remorseful, began showing up in ways he'd never had before, driving Odessa to doctor's appointments, sitting with her on weekends, slowly rebuilding a relationship with his mother built on presence instead of absence. He started small, almost tentative at first, as if unsure he'd earned the right to simply be around her again. He learned her new medication schedule without being asked. He showed up on a Saturday with a toolbox and spent the afternoon fixing the sagging gate himself, refusing to let Alex pay a contractor for something he said he should have handled 2 years earlier. Alex didn't forgive him quickly, but he watched. And over time, watching turned into something closer to trust again. Not the easy trust of childhood, but a steadier, more deliberate kind, built the way trust has to be rebuilt after it's been broken, slowly and on purpose. Terrence's path was harder and slower. He didn't disappear from the story. Alex made sure of that, insisting on family counseling sessions that were, by Terrence's own admission, some of the most uncomfortable hours of his life. There was no instant redemption. In the first session, Terrence spent most of the hour defending himself before the counselor gently redirected him again and again until the excuses ran out and something rawer took their place. There was a start, an apology delivered directly to Odessa without excuses this time, his voice breaking in a way Alex had never heard from his oldest brother, not since they were children and their father had walked out the front door for the last time. Odessa had cried and forgiven him the way only a mother could, immediately and completely, in a way that Alex privately thought was more grace than his brother had earned. But Alex made clear in the quiet conversation that followed that his own trust would be measured differently, in actions, not words, going forward. 6 months later, on a Sunday afternoon warm with early spring sun, Odessa Devereux sat on her porch, surrounded by the plants she'd always wanted, watching her 3 sons stand in the yard together, easy in a way that hadn't existed in this family for a long time. Alex had built his mother the porch he promised at 17. He'd also, without ever meaning to, forced his family to rebuild something far more important than a house, the honesty that had been missing long before he ever left for that apprenticeship overseas. She watched Julian laugh at something Terrence said, watched Alex shake his head with the small, private smile he'd had since childhood, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because everything was perfect. She knew better than most that families didn't heal in straight lines, that some conversations would still be hard, that trust once broken left a seam you could feel even after it mended, but because everything, finally, was true. No more careful phrasing on phone calls, no more silence dressed up as strength, just 3 sons standing in a yard together,
imperfect and present, which was more than she'd let herself hope for in the loneliest months of the past 2 years. Alex looked over at her, caught her watching, and crossed the yard to sit beside her on the porch swing, the two of them rocking gently in the late afternoon light. "You okay, Mama?" he asked, the same question he'd asked 100 times over a phone line from thousands of miles away. Only this time, he already knew the answer, because this time he was actually there to see it for himself. Odessa Devereux smiled, took her son's hand, and looked out over the yard at the family she'd spent a lifetime holding together, finally whole again. "I'm home, baby. We all are." Thanks for watching. This story was made and produced by Akavox. And don't forget to like and subscribe.